The wind carried the scent of dust across an ancient plain, the same wind that had swept over it for thousands of years. To the untrained eye, it was just another land beneath the sun. But to those who knew the stories, to those who had heard the whispered prophecies passed from one generation to the next, this was the ground where the impossible would one day take place. 3,000 years earlier, long before skyscrapers and satellites, before maps showed every river and road, a prophecy had been spoken. It was not vague poetry, it was not a metaphor, it was precise. It described events so unlikely, so humanly impossible, that anyone hearing it would have laughed, if they had not felt a strange chill in their bones. It spoke of a people scattered across the entire earth, their identity erased from history, their language silenced, their cities turned to rubble, yet in a single day they would return, they would be reborn. The centuries rolled forward like the turning of a massive wheel. Empires rose, each believing itself eternal, and fell to ruins. Kingdoms conquered this land and forgot it. Its hills grew silent, its rivers shrank into the earth. What had once been rich farmland became dry and barren, as if cursed. For generation after generation the prophecy seemed buried, like a seed lost beneath the sands of time. Travelers who dared to cross this land wrote of its lifelessness. The famous American writer Mark Twain visited in the 1800s and called it a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. The words of the prophecy were known, but no one could imagine such a wasteland becoming the vibrant heart of a nation again. The people themselves had been scattered so far and wide that it was almost unthinkable they could ever reunite. Driven from their homeland by war and conquest, they found themselves in Asia, Europe, Africa, living in the shadows of foreign cultures, speaking the languages of their captors. Their ancient tongue, once spoken by kings and prophets, faded into history books. Children grew up never hearing it. But time, as it always does, moved toward an appointed hour. First came whispers. Families began to feel a pull toward a land many had never seen. In tiny numbers, they returned. Farmers tried to coax crops from the stubborn earth. Settlers rebuilt crumbling homes stone by stone. The land resisted them, the soil dry and cracked, but the prophecy had promised more than just their return. It had promised the desert would bloom. Then, in the early 20th century, something began to change. Streams returned where there had been dust. Trees were planted in the tens of thousands. Crops began to thrive. Slowly, stubbornly, the land answered the call of its ancient destiny. And then, the impossible. In the aftermath of the most brutal war the world had ever seen, when the people were at their weakest, the unthinkable happened. In a single day, a nation was declared reborn. The date was etched into history. It was the exact fulfillment of a verse written thousands of years before. Shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. The language that had been silent for centuries returned to life. It was no longer just the study of scholars, it was the laughter of school children, the bargaining of merchants, the speeches of leaders. No civilization in history had ever revived a dead language to become the living, breathing heart of its culture. And yet here it was, spoken as naturally as if it had never been lost. The world was stunned. Political analysts called it a miracle of history. Military strategists called it a fluke. But the prophecy had said it would happen, and it had. No sooner was the nation reborn than it was attacked by the armies of surrounding countries. Nations determined to crush it before it could take root. Outnumbered, underarmed, barely organized, the reborn nation should have fallen in days, but it did not. War after war, conflict after conflict, the prophecy's words held true. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. And still, the story deepened. Scientists began documenting agricultural miracles in the land. Satellite images showed green fields spreading across areas that had been lifeless for millennia. Archaeologists unearthed artifacts described in scripture, their existence confirming ancient accounts long dismissed as legend. The prophecy was unfolding piece by piece, not in vague shadows but in crystal clarity, and every time it seemed finished, another detail emerged. A city once abandoned was rebuilt. Pilgrims from the four corners of the earth returned to its gates. The land that the world had forgotten was now the center of global news, its name on every tongue. Yet the prophecy did not end with rebirth. It spoke of coming trials. It hinted at a final chapter when all nations would turn their eyes, and their armies, toward this land. It foretold a shaking of heaven and earth, of signs in the sun, moon and stars. Some believe those signs have already begun, rare eclipses falling on ancient feast days, earthquakes striking fault lines that run beneath its hills, mysterious red rivers flowing in the north. The impossible had already happened. The question now was not whether the prophecy was real, it was what comes next. The day the prophecy stirred from its long slumber, the world barely noticed. It wasn't broadcast in breaking news banners or blaring sirens. It began quietly, like a spark hidden under dry wood. Ships docked at small harbors, carrying families clutching faded photographs of ancestors they had never met. Trains rolled across continents with passengers speaking dozens of languages, yet bound by the same invisible thread, the memory of a homeland they had only heard about in whispered bedtime stories. In the early years, life was unforgiving. Farmers broke the hard, sun-baked soil with their bare hands. Wells had to be dug deep, searching for stubborn water. The land's thorns and stones resisted every plow. Many wondered if they had made a terrible mistake returning. But those who remembered the prophecy clung to it like a lifeline, convinced that what had begun could not be stopped. Then came an unexpected shift in the land itself. Hills that had been gray and dusty for centuries began to wear a faint green coat in spring. Crops that had failed for decades suddenly thrived. Olive groves rooted themselves deep in ancient terraces, and vineyards sprawled across hillsides once thought barren. Scientists couldn't explain it. Local elders smiled knowingly and said the desert was only answering the voice of God. The prophecy had not only spoken of a people's return, but also of a land's resurrection. Ancient words recorded by prophets declared that streams would flow in the desert and the wilderness would blossom like the rose. What sounded poetic was becoming literal. Reservoirs filled, rivers returned, wildflowers painted the valleys in colors unseen for generations. Then history shifted in a single heartbeat. On May 14, 1948, after nearly 2 millennia without a homeland, the nation was reborn. It happened in one day, exactly as the prophecy had said. That night, as fireworks exploded in celebration, armies from surrounding nations moved toward the borders. The newborn state, barely hours old, was thrown into a war for survival. They should have lost. Every military strategist agrees on that. They had almost no trained army, few weapons, and no air force to speak of. Their enemies were larger, better equipped, and united. Yet by the end of the conflict, the newborn nation had not only survived, it had expanded its territory. This was not the last time such a miracle would occur. In war after war, in 1967, in 1973, they were outnumbered and outgunned, but emerged with victories that defied logic. Some soldiers reported events that could only be described as supernatural. Enemy units claimed to see visions that made them retreat in panic. Bombs that should have detonated failed to explode. Sandstorms rose suddenly, shielding vulnerable troops. Military reports don't record these details, but the soldiers who were there speak of them with wide eyes and hushed voices. Meanwhile, something equally impossible was happening in the heart of the nation. The ancient language, one that had been preserved only in holy books and scholarly debates, was reborn. Children spoke it fluently, markets hummed with its sound, universities taught in it. No other language in human history has been resurrected from the grave and put back into daily life after thousands of years. Yet here it was, alive and thriving, just as the prophecy had declared. Archaeologists began to unearth evidence buried for centuries, coins bearing the symbols of kings mentioned in scripture. seals with names that match the genealogies of ancient texts, stone inscriptions confirming events once dismissed as legends. Every discovery was another piece of the puzzle, another echo of the words spoken long ago. The rebirth of the land brought more than just agriculture. It brought technology, innovation, and influence. The nation became a leader in fields that barely existed when the prophecy was spoken: cybersecurity, medicine, agriculture technology. It exported crops to countries that once mocked its desolate soil. It developed systems to make fresh water from the sea. Each advancement seemed to shout the same truth: the ancient words were alive. But prophecy rarely ends in triumph alone, it also warns. The same scriptures that spoke of return and restoration also spoke of nations gathering against this land. They spoke of a time when Jerusalem would become, a cup of trembling to all nations around her. And today, the city is the center of political storms that could ignite global conflict. Every treaty, every dispute, every headline seems to revolve around it. The words written thousands of years ago read like today's newsfeed. Signs in the heavens have also stirred discussion among those who watch for prophetic fulfillment. Rare blood moons have aligned with ancient feast days. Solar eclipses have crossed continents in patterns eerily reminiscent of biblical imagery. Astronomers dismiss these as coincidence. Believers see them as, warning lights flashing across the sky. Earthquakes rumble along fault lines beneath the Mount of Olives, a place where prophecy says history will meet its final confrontation. In the north, rivers have run red without scientific explanation. In the south, locust swarms have appeared in biblical proportions. Each event on its own might be ignored, but together they form a pattern too precise to overlook. And still, the prophecy's clock ticks forward. The return has happened, the land has bloomed, the nation has survived wars it should have lost, its language lives again. The stage is set for the next act, one the ancient texts describe in detail, but one that,